Dear students, let us begin the second part of the lesson in which you will learn about the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis in the mechanism of statistical decision making. In the course of the research study, it is inevitable to undergo decision making in hypothesis testing. To ascertain that the decision is scientifically taken, it is necessary to establish that the proper inferences have been drawn and the appropriate tests have been used. This necessitates that we understand hypothesis testing thoroughly. Recall research hypothesis. Based on the perception of the researcher, a tentative statement or proposition is to be made. This statement is called a research hypothesis. For example, consider the two aspects COVID-19 and Covaxin vaccination. Now, here the research question is, does Covaxin prevent COVID-19? The possible perceptions are: perception 1, Covaxin does not prevent COVID-19. In other words, Covaxin is not effective in controlling COVID-19. The other perception 2 is Covaxin prevents COVID-19. In other words, Covaxin is effective in controlling COVID-19. In the given situation, a researcher has to select one of the above two statements according to his or her perception. That will be the research hypothesis. Testing of hypothesis procedure. This research hypothesis is to be tested using the testing of hypothesis procedure to reach a conclusion whether to reject or do not reject the null hypothesis. Testing of the hypothesis procedure. Step 1. In any statistical test of significance, the first step is to define and identify the null hypothesis denoted by H0 and the alternative hypothesis denoted by H1 or HA. Step 2. The next step is to select the significance level. Step 3. Calculate the test statistic value, which is called calculated value. Step 4. Compare it with the critical value. They are table value or p value, which is the value of the statistic calculated based on the significance level. Step 5. Inference. Decide whether to reject or not to reject the null hypothesis. Hypothesis framing. First step in the testing of hypothesis procedure, correctly setting up the hypothesis is an essential part of statistical inference. When formulating a hypothesis, usually some theory is put forward and it is believed to be true, but it has not proven yet. Hypothesis framing. Broadly, there are three categories of hypothesis a researcher will come across. 1. Research hypothesis. 2. Null hypothesis. 3. Alternative hypothesis. Hypothesis framing. Test procedure demands the researcher to frame two hypotheses, namely null hypothesis H0 and alternative hypothesis H1. Both are all statement form. Null hypothesis H0. How to write null hypothesis? Usually, the null hypothesis refers to the status quo and proposes that nothing special has happening. The null hypothesis is always states that the variables under study do not make a difference. Instead, the burden is on the data to prove otherwise. Alternative hypothesis H1. How to write alternative hypothesis? The null hypothesis is accompanied by a claim of competing against it called the alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis would mean that something special has happening or there is a difference. Null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis are complements. that is opposite of each other. This point we should always remember. It is imperative for the researcher to have a clear idea about these hypotheses. Research hypothesis, it is the perception of the researcher in a statement form. Statistical hypothesis, null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. Logic of acceptance. The test procedure accepts the alternative hypothesis only if the probability of the outcome of the null hypothesis is extremely low. Importance of alternative hypothesis. The researcher always intends to establish the alternative hypothesis because an alternative hypothesis is imperative for any research. Reason. When H0 is rejected, then decision cannot be made unless alternative hypothesis H1 is given. Hence, writing alternative hypothesis H1 is a must. One-tailed and two-tailed tests. A one-tailed probability explores the directional relationship left only or right only between the variables. A two-tailed probability has no directional relationship. It may have any direction, left or right, between the variables. One-tailed and two-tailed tests. As the name suggests, in a two-tailed test, the rejection region is on both the tails of the distribution, whereas a one-tailed test, the rejection is only at the relevant side. The selection of the alternative hypothesis decides the nature of the test to be used. Students, I hope you understand all the concepts. We will continue in the next video. Thank you.